Substantiate, to establish by proof or competent evidence. Welcome back to Substantiate. I'm the host, William Glasser, bringing you hypothetical sports matchups every single week. Yes, welcome back to Substantiate. I am William Glasser, and I gotta keep this intro short today. So today, Robert Land from the Houston Sports Talk podcast, he came on and we talked about how so many Houston sports stars have just left their teams in Houston. Again, we'll get into that in great detail. He has a lot of great stories, some things that I didn't know about, a lot of stuff inside the organizations. And this episode isn't a hypothetical matchup like it usually is. I just saw this story, and I mentioned it in last week's episode with Joe Daly. And I thought, hey, you know what? That sounds like a good episode idea. And after we recorded this episode, J.J. Watt signed a $31 million two-year contract with the Cardinals that includes $23 million guaranteed, so we don't mention that in this episode, but keep it in mind as we talk about him for a little bit. Again, shorter intro today, and let's throw it to this episode. Today, I am joined by Robert Land from the Houston Sports Talk podcast. How are you today, Robert?
Doing pretty good. It's been a long week in Houston, as you might imagine.
Yeah. So how has Houston felt the impacts of this storm as a city?
Oh, it's been real difficult. I mean, it's about 1.4 million, I think, maybe at one point that of the households that didn't have electricity. I lost electricity for 3 days, had to stay with a friend. That friend then lost electricity after one night. So then I had to stay with somebody else for the next 2 nights. We had a boil water effect, low water pressure all week. Most of that is gone at this point. But yeah, it's been incredibly hard. And Houston has just been hit with one thing after another over the last few years. You know, we've had Harvey, we had another 2 major floods that were not Harvey level, but pretty bad for just about any other city in the country. So it just seems like we're getting one shot after another. And the climate change is really affecting us a lot. I grew up here. This is not the norm, what's been going on here the last few years.
Yeah. Well, we're glad that you're safe now and able to record with me tonight. And so before we get into the main topic today, do you want to give a brief overview of Houston Sports Talk and yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Houston Sports Talk. I've been doing the podcast now for nearly 8 years, going back to 2013.
Wow.
It's a weekly podcast. We were on the radio for about a year and a half at one point too. We've done well over 1,000 shows. These days, I would co-host with my friend Stephen Kerr. Between the two of us, we've been doing sports journalism, been in the business for about 60 years, each of us around 30 or so. And also, you know, just great guests over the years, fantastic guests. We've had Jose Altuve, Rockets Hall of Famer Calvin Murphy, George Springer, Astros World Series MVP. You're up in Toronto, I know, and you've got a great one. I absolutely love George Springer, one of my all-time favorite athletes ever, one of my favorite Houston athletes of all time for sure. NFL Hall of Famers like Elvin Bethea, Robert Brazil from the old Houston Oilers, Simone Biles, the Olympic gold medalist, has been a guest on our show, Dallas Keuchel, Cy Young Award winner.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I've been listening to it for the last couple of weeks, just trying to scout out a guest for this episode. And it's a great podcast. And even though I'm not a Houston sports fan, if anyone listening just wants to listen to a great podcast, go listen to Houston Sports Talk.
Yeah, thanks a lot. In 30 years, I worked in Missouri and Little Rock and Memphis, as well as Houston as a mostly producer and sports videographer for some different stations, doing all sorts of different things. But I've covered Super Bowls, NBA playoffs, NCAA basketball tournament, a little bit of everything for the different markets and different teams, and just a lot of experience. I don't know if I'm considered a big name in Houston, but the experience is definitely there. And I'm somebody that's more behind the scenes, I guess, for a lot of people around here. But the podcast has been a really nice deal, great creative format for me. And as a fan of Houston, as somebody that grew up here in the 70s and 80s, I have a super affection for not only the city, but all these sports teams. I mean, I've been a sports fan since I was 5, or as long as I can remember, let's just say.
And you just mentioned the city in general. And as we get into the main topic today, which is so many different players leaving Houston, and is anything about the city changed at all? Is there any reason besides just their relationships with the franchises and different situations that would contribute to them wanting to leave the city?
No, it's nothing about Houston. They all say great things about the city. I mean, we can go through them one at a time. Garrett Cole, they weren't going to pay for. They lost Garrett Cole, of course, after going to the World Series back in 2019. Yep. Justin Verlander, I feel like that's a loss, even though he's still on the team. He's going to try to come back after some Tommy John surgery. But, Garrett Cole and Justin Verlander, just losing them for any sports franchise or for any city would be a big deal. A couple of all-time great pitchers. But, George Springer, I guess it was a situation where he just wasn't going to get the money that he wanted with the Astros. And he's in his early 30s, and the Astros just have to look, because they've got so many players that are really great that they're either paying right now or they're going to have to pay in the future. So it was one of those deals where, do you want to pay him well into his late 30s? They, I guess, didn't feel like it was worth it. That's a big loss for me, because he's such a chemistry guy in the locker room. And, I know people know about a little bit about George Springer's story, but I mean, this is a guy that was just beloved, not only what he did on the field and one of the great Astros clutch players of all time. You could argue he's the best, but if he's not, he's in the top 3 or 4 best Astros clutch players. But he's somebody that's overcome a stuttering problem from when he was a kid. Mm-hmm. He was part of Club Astro, which, if the people that have watched baseball don't know, the Astros going back to 2016, 2017, Springer was the DJ in the locker room. He was the guy that set the tone. He's walking around at all times with a smile on his face. He's just a light of a person. That's probably the biggest loss of all the Astros players, to be honest with you. But the Harden situation, I mean,
yeah,
I think everybody knows that's been very public. I mean, the issue with Harden was that he just didn't feel like he could win with the talent on the Rockets, and the Rockets bent over backwards. They did everything they could over the last 8 years, 9 years. He was running the team. He frankly ran them into some bad deals, most notably the Russell Westbrook trade that really was a crushing deal. And he called that shot. Daryl Morey, who is now with the Sixers and leaves. And maybe that's why Harden didn't trust this organization, because Daryl Morey was leaving, but maybe Daryl Morey knew that James Harden was thinking about leaving. I don't know what was going on behind the scenes, but Morey didn't want to make that deal for Russell Westbrook, because that's just not the type of deal Daryl Morey would make. And he was forced into it, from all accounts, by Harden and by the owner, Tillman Fertitta, who was basically taking Harden's side on that. Mm-hmm. Chris Paul, he went through that injury-plagued season. It looked like he was losing it really fast. And unfortunately, the Rockets sold low with Chris Paul, as we've seen, and what he then was able to get from the Phoenix Suns. And then they sold low again on Russell Westbrook. Luckily, they were able to get John Wall. So that's been a good thing. That's worked out well. But yeah, the James Harden thing, let me just say this to you, William. I just don't understand James Harden as somebody that goes over to the Nets, and all of a sudden I see him with Brooklyn, and here he is. He's Mr. Facilitator. He's playing more of a team game,
averaging like 11 assists.
Yeah, and he could get assists for the Rockets, but it's not just that he's getting assists, it's that he's deferring a little bit, and he's not ball hogging all of the time. It's not just him dribbling for 10 seconds at the top of the key that would frustrate even the most ardent Harden supporter and the most ardent fan of the Rockets, because you just felt like you're not getting some different guys touches, and it was wearing James out. So by the time the playoffs rolled around, it seemed like it was wearing him out. He would be terrible in the playoffs. And anybody that's like, oh, James Harden's finally figured it out, well, let's get to the playoffs first with Brooklyn, and let's see if he can do it. Luckily, he's not going to be counted on to make the big shots, because they have Kevin Durant to do that now. And maybe that helps him out, as far as that helps the team move on. But let's see what James Harden does in the playoffs, because, man, I've seen him make some stupid decisions. I've seen him disappear many times. Just a lot of different stuff. I mean, I could go for hours on James Harden. You can hear what I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah, so if we start with going more in depth into this Rocket situation that you've elaborated on for the last couple minutes. And so there was James Harden, who comes to the Rockets back in 2013.
Right. Yeah, I believe it was 2013 or 20. It was either 2012 or 13.
Yeah,
Was it that 20? I think it
either
was the
way, it was
12-13 season. I want to say was
oh
when
yeah,
he came over.
yeah. So that time span, and he comes in, and there was stereotype Harden, which was ball hog and no defense, and you touched a
Well,
little bit on the ball hog.
I want to say this. When he came in, it wasn't so much of Harden with the ball in his hand the first couple of years. That started to happen more when D'Antoni showed up, and D'Antoni just said, "You're the point guard. You're going to be the primary ball handler. We're setting it all up around." And the offense was prolific because of that, but it wasn't good when the playoffs rolled around and its teams all of a sudden could zero in on James because he was in the same spot at the top of the key, and you could bring over traps or you could bring over different things. And then when he got rid of the ball, because D'Antoni didn't really push it, and we'll see if he does anything different with the Nets. And I don't know if he's doing a ton different with the Nets, but when the ball is passed, then he doesn't move without the ball. His defense was terrible a few years ago, and then I think he was embarrassed into being a better defensive player. I think he can be a actually good defensive player or a definite above average defensive player when he wants to at times when there are spots in the game. But overall, I think he's average, not terrible like he's portrayed, or it might be portrayed because of those years where they were putting up YouTube videos of him, and showing all the stuff where he just wasn't trying at all.
And so with Westbrook and Chris Paul coming through, and why did Harden want things changed? Since Harden left OKC back in the early 2010s, now he's played with each of his co-stars from that. It wasn't as much of a big three then, but would be considered one now. He played with Westbrook and then now with Durant again. Is there a reason that Harden wanted to play with each of them?
As far as Chris Paul is concerned, it was outstanding the first year that Chris Paul was there, and the Rockets were a Chris Paul hamstring away from winning the championship. And then the second year, Chris Paul and him were not getting along, and it's harder to yell at James Harden and get upset with him when Chris Paul, he's perfectionist and he's the type that likes to do that. It's hard to do that when you're not playing all that great because you're injured all the time. And that's what happened. I mean, Chris Paul was just a shell of himself in that last season with the Rockets. But 3 years ago, I guess it is now, when they went 7 games against Golden State and they took that incredible Golden State team, which is going to go down as one of the great, if not the greatest team that's ever been assembled. You could talk about the old Celtics teams, but there were whatever it was, 8 teams in the NBA at that point, or 12 or whatever, however many teams that they had to go against when they were winning championship after championship. But that Golden State team, I mean, you're talking about as good a team that's ever been assembled. And the Rockets were the only team to take them to 7 games over that span outside of the Cleveland team with LeBron and Kevin Love and Kyrie Irving that took them to 7. And that was because Draymond Green gets kicked out, for trying to, punch LeBron somewhere where he shouldn't have been trying to punch LeBron. That's the only other team that's done it. In the Western Conference, there was nobody that gave Golden State more hell than the Rockets did.
Yeah, that's the second episode in a row that Draymond Green and that has come up. Just kind of funny. And yeah, so there's James Harden, and he kind of called the shots in Houston for a little while. That's what it sounds like. Is that what really happened?
Yes, that is exactly what happened. And the shots were not tremendously good, obviously, at times. And he was spoiled. I mean, there were reports that he would come to the bus when he wanted to come to the bus, and people would wait for an hour on the bus coming to games. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that it's not leadership. And that's the other thing. It might work better in Brooklyn because Kevin Durant is the de facto leader because he's got the rings and he's got all of the pull there. He was the first one there. So now Harden is more or less riding the coattails. But when Harden was here, he's just not a leader. He's not somebody that acted like a leader when he should have. There were things that he did that showed leadership, but there was a lot of stuff that just was not what a leader should be. And there were a lot of times where everybody is looking to Harden and Harden's not doing what a leader should do. And I think that was the big problem. The Westbrook thing at the end, I think James just realized, I don't know if it was Westbrook that he wanted out of there. I think Westbrook knew it wasn't working. So he demanded a trade, but Harden demanded a trade just because he has felt like, yeah, just being Westbrook is just, it's not good enough. And it's unfortunate because I think if James would have stayed around and tried to change the way that he was acting and the way that he was doing things, I think him and Christian Wood would have been the most dangerous pick and roll combination outside of LeBron James and Anthony Davis. And Christian Wood, for those people that haven't seen Christian Wood, he was averaging before he went down, and the Rockets then cannot win a game after that, 7 in a row, as you and I are speaking, and it might be 8 in a row by the time we're done. But Christian Wood was averaging 22 points, 10 rebounds. He was hitting 38% from three. He is probably the most versatile pick and roll guy in the NBA, not named Anthony Davis, and somebody that the Rockets had gotten for cheap too. So it allows you to go out and get other talent. They got him for 3 years, $41 million. And you put that with John Wall, that I think is a much better complement to James because he is a much better spot up shooter than Russell Westbrook, who was just terrible at it. You didn't want him to shoot and you were scared when he did. And then also John Wall is a much better defender than Russell Westbrook is. So in that way, they complement each other. The Rockets also added some guys that I think would have been really good compliments to James if he had given it a shot. So now he goes to Brooklyn and everybody's going to say, well, yeah, he won a championship. Smart guy. He went to go play with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. If that happens, if they win it, that will be what's talked about. I just don't think as a player, it would be as fun if you're James Harden, who's won MVPs and is always in the top 5 in the MVP conversation, to win a championship when you're bandwagoning another team as opposed to you're the lead dog. That's unfortunate for him, but I'm not sad to see him go because I just felt like you weren't going to win a championship with James as a leader. And I didn't see a way for somebody else to come in that was better than him and that could take over the leadership role. Cause I don't think James would have seen it that way. He would have seen it that the Rockets, they're my team.
And last thing about the Rockets before we transition into the Texans, but with James Harden, what was the last straw? I mean, he was supposedly offered like $50 million a year and he turned that down.
Yeah, it just wasn't the money. He wanted to win a championship. He didn't think the straw was basically, he just didn't think he could do it anymore with this organization. And I don't know if D'Antoni's departure had anything to do with it and Daryl Morey's departure had anything to do with it. I think from a fan's perspective, I mean, just if people don't understand this, Daryl Morey is perhaps, not even perhaps, I think he might very well be the most beloved general manager that the city has ever seen. He was a great guy on social media. He rarely made bad moves as a player personnel guy. He did some really creative things contractually. There was some things towards the end you didn't agree with, but as we found out, it was a lot of James Harden. D'Antoni, I think the fans were ready to see somebody else because they just didn't feel like D'Antoni's system was the type of system that could win a championship. And the only thing I could think of is, besides the fact that he just didn't think there was enough talent, is he had a great relationship with Daryl. He had a great relationship with D'Antoni, and he wanted out at that point.
It's amazing how a player like James Harden can manage to just get his way out, show up a little overweight, and he's gone, and how sudden it felt in ways. Anyway, so kind of keeping on track with a player wanting out, Deshaun Watson and JJ Watt with the Houston Texans. And what has happened here? What over the last few years has led up to this? Like JJ Watt has played here forever, and Deshaun Watson was just drafted a few years ago, and they've even been in the playoffs. So what's going on?
Okay, this is kind of a longer story, unfortunately, but I'm going to try to condense it as much as possible. And Deshaun and JJ are two different things completely, as just a football moves. But as far as the Texans are concerned, Bill O'Brien was the coach for several years. He was pretty much not liked at all by Texans fans, even though they were winning the division, because they were barely winning the division. It was 9-7 records when they were getting into the playoffs. They did get into the playoffs, I think 4 or 5 times with Bill O'Brien as the coach, but people didn't like him. They didn't think he was a coach that could win a championship. His personality wise, he was terrible, was not friendly, was not good with the media, was not good with anything in particular, but he did have some teams that had enough talent, and it was in a bad division. So he was able to get into the playoffs. But what happened a couple of years ago was the Texans GM for a long time that people did not think was the best GM in the world, Rick Smith, although he did draft Deshaun Watson, he did draft JJ Watt, he did draft DeAndre Hopkins. He made some really great picks in the first round, but Rick Smith, his wife gets cancer, and so he resigns. And when he resigned, they brought in another GM, Brian Gaine. And then not long after that, they brought in this guy named Jack Easterby. And if people are not familiar with the Jack Easterby story, that's what happened to the Texans, because Jack Easterby basically came in as a chaplain, and O'Brien, I guess, knew him from his time with the Patriots. And Easterby came in as just somebody in the organization, and he slowly basically took it over. He became Bill O'Brien's right-hand guy. He was a Jim Jones, like handing the poisonous Kool-Aid to everything that was going on in the Texans organization. They ended up firing Brian Gaine, I think, because of Easterby. And at that point, they gave the general managing job to Bill O'Brien. At the same point, we think that Easterby was also helping make those moves. And after that, they just made one awful move after another. DeAndre Hopkins maybe will go down as the worst trade in NFL history. There's no doubt about that. But then they made one terrible draft pick, trading draft picks. I mean, just one thing after another. And so it starts to catch up with them at the beginning of this past season. And they go 0-4, 0-5 to start the season. And Bill O'Brien finally gets fired. And it was Jack Easterby that got him fired. After Jack Easterby was a part of all these moves, the Texan, JJ Watt, goes to Jack Easterby. He asked the players, I guess, to text him. He then goes to the owner, Cal McNair, who takes over for his dad. And he's referred to by some people quietly in the organization as Tommy Boy, because if you know the movie Tommy Boy, he's basically this kid that has no idea what he's doing, but his dad's the owner. So he comes in after his dad passes away and has no idea what he's doing, and listens to whoever. And he gets totally brainwashed by this Jack Easterby. And apparently obviously Easterby's religious, but Cal McNair, very religious too, very Christian. And they connect on that level. And that's basically what happens, in that Deshaun goes to Cal McNair and says, I want to be a part of this general managing hire, because he knows that they have no idea what they're doing. And he sees what Easterby is doing to run the organization. And he gets in on stuff, he thinks. And as soon as the year is over with, and I'm wrapping this up as quickly as I can, but It's hard. But Easterby basically goes to Cal McNair, has a prayer session the day after the season's over with. They quickly go out, and during the prayer session, he says, yeah, God's telling me we need Nick Caserio. And that's somebody they had never even interviewed to this point and didn't talk to Deshaun about. And without Deshaun having any discussions with them about that, they quickly go hire Nick Caserio within a day or two. And Deshaun's like, wait a second, I thought at least I would get part of the discussion with whoever the candidates were. And he just doesn't trust Cal McNair anymore. Now, he hasn't come out explicitly against Easterby because I think he likes him personally, maybe. But Andre Johnson, the Texans' all-time great wide receiver, destined for the Hall of Fame, one of the greats that I've ever seen. Andre Johnson doesn't say anything. I mean, this is somebody that has never been controversial, doesn't talk, doesn't have his opinion out there. Hadn't tweeted in a year and a half of anything beyond, maybe an advertisement or something once. But he comes out on Twitter and says, Easterby is the problem. And when Andre Johnson, we all knew it, but when Andre Johnson comes out and says it, that's like Mother Teresa saying, I hate this person. And so that was it. That's why you saw Deshaun Watson. Now, JJ Watt asked to be let go because he sees the writing on the wall. He understands that the team's not good. He knows that he doesn't have long left. I don't know if this was about Easterby also or not, or just the fact that he just said, I don't have much left in the tank. And, JJ Watt this is not the JJ Watt pre the injuries from 2015, 2016, where he missed. Early in his career, those first few years, I've watched a lot of football. I'm almost 50 years old now. And JJ Watt was the best defensive player I've seen in my lifetime. A defensive end that could intercept passes, that could get triple teamed on a regular basis, was pretty much unstoppable as a one-on-one defensive end. could get 20 sack seasons on the regular, three-time defensive MVP, just a dominating player. Put in at tight end one year for a few games, caught 3 or 4 touchdowns that year. I mean, he was everything. I mean, the guy was everything. And of course, I don't think I have to tell anybody what he meant to the city of Houston off the field. I mean, he was everything. I said it on my podcast. He was everything you wanted your son to emulate if you were a dad. He was everything that as a 10-year-old, as a 12-year-old, he was everything you wanted to look up to. I got to be around the Texans for 5 years covering them. I saw him on a regular basis. He was that guy. I saw him with fans. I saw him grabbing people's phones and taking selfies with them and signing every autograph and finding every kid in a wheelchair or that had a disability or whatever. He was the real deal, is the real deal. And everybody in Houston is glad to see him go because they feel like he deserves a chance at a championship before it's all over with.
And he did win the Walter Payton Award in 2017, it looks like.
Yeah, that was what he did with raising. I think it was 40 some odd million. It might be way more than that. But at the time, it went beyond 37. I know that for Hurricane Harvey.
Yeah, great person and great player, and not much more to ask for from a great player. And then touching on Deshaun Watson quickly, more so in just the way that the NFL works. In the NBA, the players have a lot of power. James Harden shows up fat, he gets sent to Brooklyn. And in this case, Deshaun Watson, if you show up in bad shape at the start of practices in the summer, you're going to get hurt. So he can't do that. And just the power dynamics in football are so different. And depending on whether he gets traded or not, what does this mean for the league in the future?
There is no NFL owner that wants the Texans to trade Deshaun Watson and get forced into that because, well, maybe the owner that gets him, but the other ones do not want that to happen because they don't want that precedent set. And remember, he just signed an extension at the beginning of this football season, but that extension does not kick in until not this coming season, but the following season. So if they trade him, they're taking the hit for the entire guaranteed money that he gets on his contract up front. And so the Texans, it's awful. No matter what you get, you're never going to get what you should for a guy that's, one of the top 3 to 5 quarterbacks. I mean, I think he made the jump this past year. I thought he's a top 10 guy, but I don't know if he's that elite quarterback. But the guy that I watched this year, once Bill O'Brien left, and that was a big deal because Bill O'Brien stunk as an offensive coordinator, even though he thought he was a genius and he was calling all the plays. Once he was gone, we saw what Deshaun could do. And Deshaun made another leap as a quarterback, his brain power, just what he was doing out there. And so, Deshaun Watson is going to ask for a trade, but they can say, if the Texans want to, even if you hold out with the collective bargaining agreement, what they did a year or two ago, what that means is if he holds out, there's no way to recoup that money. So, he can miss games, but he's not going to get the money back. Now, it's not the money that he gets on the extension. Once the extension kicks in, when he's missing games, we're talking $3 million or so, or $2.5 million a game, as opposed to what he's making this year, where it's maybe several $100,000 a game. 600,000, I want to say, is what he'll miss per game this year. So, and you're right, you can't in football just not try, or you get hurt, or something really bad can happen to you. So him not trying isn't an option. And Deshaun is much more of a character guy than James Harden. He's not the guy that's just going to quit. I don't see him as that type of guy. So, it's going to be a game of chicken. And I think the Texans can win that game of chicken with Deshaun Watson. Now, is his heart going to be in it? Is he going to give it 150%? I don't think so. I don't know. But I think he's going to have to play if it comes to that. I don't know if there's a way out of that. And if the Texans trade him, I mean, there's a lot of people in this area that have already quit this franchise because of what they've seen the owner do to just hand over the franchise to a chaplain that knows nothing about football. And that is literally what has happened. But if Deshaun leaves, the fan base, is gone. I already know that a bunch of people, season ticket holders that have sold even PSLs, original season ticket holders, personal seat license people, that it's not even good for them to sell, or it just, a lot of people are just stuck because you're in this contract with the personal seat license. It's terrible because you're sort of handcuffed by the organization, but people aren't going to show up. Even if the virus goes away and the seats can be full, it's going to be a half empty stadium. If Deshaun stays, if Deshaun goes, I mean, that place is going to be crickets. I mean, it's this team, what Bill O'Brien did to this team talent wise, outside of Deshaun and maybe Laramie Tunsil, the all pro left tackle, outside of those two guys, it's terrible. The talent here is awful. It's going to take Nick Caserio, if he can do it, the new Texans GM, it's going to take him at least 2 or 3 years because they're also in salary cap hell. There's guys that should be just flat out cut.
So who's the backup quarterback?
AJ McCarron is your backup, the Alabama national champion. AJ McCarron is your backup quarterback.
Wow. Who knows? Maybe he'll become the starter next year if Watson holds out. And now transitioning into the Astros. And I saved the Astros for last year because with the whole cheating scandal, it's all a little bit tainted. But so there have been players like George Springer, Garrett Cole leaving, and those were two of their best players. Garrett Cole, who, just went straight on into the Astros rivals over the last couple of years, the Yankees, and picking it right up and having a great shortened season with them last year. Now George Springer up here to Toronto. So the Astros as a whole franchise, I think they've recovered pretty well since the cheating scandal. But what's it really like?
Well, I just want to say one quick thing about the cheating scandal for your listeners, that where the Astros basically were like Judas. They took all of the attention. Everything that's wrong with baseball is the Astros' fault. The Astros apparently have been the only team cheating in the history of baseball since the Black Sox scandals from 1919. Even though we know that it's rampant, the sign stealing around baseball. The Red Sox were found guilty. Apparently, Cora, the manager, led everything with the Astros, as we know, but he knew nothing. He literally knew nothing that was going on with the Red Sox. And if you believe that, I've got some great stock in some fossil fuel companies to sell you right now, because it just is ridiculous. I mean, does that make what the Astros did right? No, but the idea that the Astros were the only team cheating that year, and remember the teams that they beat in the playoffs, the Yankees, which have some cheating in their background, and Carlos Beltran who was on the Astros, was on the Yankees the year before he was on the Astros, and apparently Beltran was leading the cheating scandal, but when he was with the Yankees, I guess he was doing nothing. So there you go. And then if you look at the history, there was guys using amphetamines in the 70s. There's always been guys scuffing baseballs. And then we know about the steroids and the HGH stuff all through the 90s and early 2000s. And, The Athletic did a story that said 99%. This was a few months ago that they talked to tons of people in baseball who said 99% of the pitchers cheat today. Like, not cheat, but put stuff on the baseball. Well, that's cheating. Putting stuff on the baseball is supposedly not supposed to happen. And then the Angels clubhouse guy was giving this stuff to put on baseballs to everybody. Max Scherzer, Colin Verlander, yes, but every player he was giving that to. So yeah, the Astros, was what they did wrong, but I just felt like it was just way too much about it was all the Astros' fault, and it's so easy to blame one organization. But yeah, they've bounced back, and they were one game away from going to the World Series last year. The incredible thing about it is they lost Colin Verlander. Framber Valdez was one of the best pitchers in baseball last year. He's very young. Jose Urquidy, who the year before, he missed a lot of the year with injuries and COVID, but he was good in the playoffs the year before in the World Series. He was great. So they've got two really good young pitchers. They've got a third, Christian Javier, who was great in the playoffs this year, is another good young starter that they've got. And they still have Lance McCullers, who's pretty darn good. And they've got Zach Greinke, who I think is their fifth starter, who's a Hall of Famer. So they're going to be really good this year. And their lineup, even though they lost George Springer, Jose Altuve, He's won an MVP. Bregman's been in the top 3 in the MVP race. Carlos Correa is one of the best shortstops in baseball. They're bringing back their rookie of the year from 2 years ago. Didn't play last year because of a knee injury. And Yordan Alvarez, who had almost 1,000 OPS and had over 1,000 OPS in the World Series in 2019. He's coming back. He's going to be in the lineup. They've got Kyle Tucker, who's a potential all-star, was fantastic last year in his first full season playing in the outfield. So they're loaded in the lineup. They've got a really good starting rotation. They've done some good moves in the bullpen this offseason. And then they had some young guys like Paredes that came through last postseason, and last season, another young guy, a rookie that was fantastic. So, the Astros, that's the team that everybody here is excited about, and they're fine.
They were ranked number 10, I believe, on the power rankings, which came out today.
From all of the analytics, they're favored to win the AL West, to win 90 plus games this year. And the people that hate the Astros, the guys that quote unquote cheated, there's very few of them left. Springer is gone. If you're a Toronto fan, you're now rooting for one of the cheaters. Congratulations.
Jose Altuve.
Yeah, Altuve, by everybody's account that has gone through the tapes, they never found trash can banging from Jose Altuve that year. All of the players said, yeah, we cheated, but he was not involved. So the guys that you're mad at that are still there, that were in the cheating scandal, Correa and Bregman and Yuli Gurriel, and that's pretty much it. Nobody else is from that 2017 team in the lineup, and there's very few guys. There's only a couple guys even in the pitching staff. So if you hate the Astros, you hate the old Astros, because we have a different general manager. We have a different manager. A lot of people in the organization have changed around. So this is not the guys that cheated, basically. You can boo those 3 guys when they come up to bat, but that's it. And Jose Altuve, the evidence is shown both from people that have looked through every single pitch that year, the John Boys on Twitter, and even an Astros fan that's listened through everything and said, yeah, there was trash can banging from a lot of these guys, but we just can't. We found Altuve did it a couple of times early in the year, like literally a handful of times, and then that was it. And he didn't like it. He didn't feel good about it, so he stopped doing it. Yeah, so that the Astros they're going to be good. The only concern with them this year is going to be, can their young pitchers that pitched quite a bit last year, that have not pitched full seasons, can they handle pitching a full year, and do they have the arm strength? Because it's going to be tough on a lot of pitchers around baseball.
It's going on across the league.
Yeah, a lot of you got pitchers that are going to have to go from pitching in a 60-game season to a 162-game season. That's going to be tough on a lot. We're going to see some injuries this year.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, as an Astro fan, you just have to understand how devastating this is, because I've been rooting for this team my whole life, almost 50 years. We had never won a World Series. We were right there with the Cleveland Indians and the Cubs and those teams that had never won a World Series. And the Cubs finally won a World Series after, all that time. And congratulations to Cubs fans and other teams that had the long drought. And the Astros fans, not only had they never won a World Series, they got to the World Series once and they lost every game in it. They got swept by the White Sox back in 2005. So to finally get there in this dream season following Hurricane Harvey and what that team meant to the city, we went from being under several feet of water, people's lives and homes being destroyed all over the city in late August and early September, to just 2 months later, instead of rain and floodwaters coming down, it was confetti coming down from downtown buildings. And it just meant everything to the city. And they seemed like the best guys in the world. You can debate that is not the case now, obviously, but that's what they appeared to be. I mean, there were all of these great stories. They did so much, not only on the field, but what they were doing off the field and helping people in the community during that time. And to finally win the World Series in this just dream fashion, not just after Hurricane Harvey, but to go through the Red Sox, the Yankees, and the Dodgers, like 3 of the organizations in baseball that everybody would look to, along with the St. Louis Cardinals, that very underrated organization because they're in the Midwest. But I mean, those are the signature organizations, and they went through all of them in the playoffs with clutch hitting, and not just clutch hitting when they were at home next to video monitors, but clutch hitting on the road at Dodger Stadium with crowds screaming to the point where there's no way they could have heard trash cans banging or any of that stuff. to go through all of that and finally win. And I was in tears afterwards as an Astros fan, like so many Astros fans were. We were just in tears that they had finally won it after all those years. We had gone to the playoffs 11 times over the last 40 years and had not got to the World Series and even won a game. I mean, and won a game in a World Series before all that, and then to go and win the championship.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants to see cheating in any sport, in any part of life. And, obviously it's something that unfortunately happened here that's been going on, like you were saying, for decades. And hopefully with what the MLB has been doing, hopefully they can really put in as much of an end to it as they can. Yeah, so that was the Rockets, the Texans, and the Astros, and some of their major players leaving or wanting out. And do you have any last thoughts, Robert, before we sign off tonight?
I guess it's just weird because Houston never gets much of anything on a national basis. And it's so frustrating because over the last year, it's been all of this attention, but all for the worst things, whether it's the Astros cheating scandal, whether it's the Texans that are just a total, complete crap show mess, whether it's the James Harden drama and all of that sort of stuff. It's frustrating in that way. And that you've wanted for years to get that attention nationally. And if you go back even to our two big championships that we can still look on in 94 and 95 with the Rockets, and in 94, in the middle of the finals, when all of the attention should have been on the Rockets and the Knicks, the New York team that was in the championship, instead, it became the O.J. Simpson show. We couldn't even get the cover of Sports Illustrated after we won the championship and beat the Knicks in 7 games. And Akeem Olajuwon was the MVP of the NBA because it had to be O.J. Simpson on the cover of Sports Illustrated, that week. And, and then everybody said, well, those championships didn't count because Michael Jordan didn't play, although he did play in 1995 and he looked pretty good when he was scoring 55 in the Garden in the middle of that comeback. I'm sure every fan has got their own chip on their shoulder, but it's been a long battle over the years in Houston to get one for the Astros. And, you talk about the Texans. Well, you combine them with the Oilers. There's not many NFL franchises that have never been to a Super Bowl. The Houston franchises have never been. You put them with the Lions and the Browns, a couple of the teams that have never even, not just won a Super Bowl, got to a Super Bowl. And it's not just that. The Oilers, Texans haven't got to a conference championship game in 41 years. Not even a conference. That's winning 2 playoff games. They can't win 2 playoff games to get to a conference championship.
It came close in 2019.
Yeah.
But didn't make it. And so where else can people find you? Obviously on Houston Sports Talk and Twitter, or where else?
Yeah, of course, Houston Sports Talk. It's on Spotify, Apple, Google, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. And then on Twitter, it's at HST Podcast. My co-host, Stephen Kerr, does a fantastic job with me. You and I are talking early in the week after the storms. This week, I'm going to have an interview with the play-by-play voice of the Houston Cougars basketball team, which really has been an incredible bright spot the last 2 or 3 years with Kelvin Sampson. They were 6th in the country. They dropped to 12th this week after a loss, but only 3 losses this year.
Yeah, that's great. Go check out Houston Sports Talk podcast and all those links down in the show notes. Have a great week, Robert. Hope Houston and Texas recovers quickly. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Substantiate. The best way to help support the show is to, number 1, tell your friends about Substantiate. That is the number 1 way to support us. The second way is to leave us a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. Number 3, follow us at substantiatepod on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook.
Hello, I'm Anthony.
And I'm Dr. Issues.
And we're hosts of Capes on the Couch, the podcast where comics get counseling.
Superheroes don't always get to go home happy. That's where we come in.
We offer psychiatric and mental health analysis of comic book characters.
So check us out at capesonthecouch.live and across all social media platforms at Capes on the Couch.